Okay, the nervous system. And all of this is framed by this overarching homeostasis concept, right? The nervous system, we'll talk a little bit about how it works, but then we're primarily going to be concerned with how it helps to regulate and control various processes that contribute to achieving this homeostasis that's been so critically important all along. Okay, so there's a couple of things we got to get out of the way, first of all. There's a little sort of an overall kind of flow chart we could draw or make, which would sort of give us some idea of the kind of outline of the nervous system. So obviously there is a stimulus that occurs in some way, shape, or form. That stimulus then is transferred to what we call afferent neurons. That's a word you'll want to get to know. Afferent neurons. And if my writing is small, page 517 in your textbook has this same sort of chart. And then we move from there to what we call interneurons. Interneurons. And then we move, I'm going to have to swing around here because I don't have enough space. Then we move to the efferent neurons. Efferent and afferent are two words. We'll get to them in a minute. You'll want to. The what? E-N-T. Afferent and efferent. There's no O's in either word. And then, of course, what we have are the effectors and some kind of response or action. Okay? So then what I'll do is I'm going to put a little red circle around the interneuron part. That's sort of the integration section. That's sort of what's happening in the brain, or not necessarily the brain. It could also be the spinal cord. We'll see. That's the integration sort of area. And then you have your sort of incoming and outgoing. And that's essentially what afferent means. Afferent means incoming. So the way your nervous system is set up is you have a central nervous system, which consists of your brain and spinal cord, and then you have all these nerves that branch out from there into the body. So stimuli from senses are coming into the brain through the afferent neurons, and then over here, the efferent neurons are the outgoing signals that are heading from the brain out to various parts of the body, like the muscles or perhaps glands or things that the message is meant to interact with, the effectors to produce a response. So we have this sort of incoming wiring and outgoing wiring. If you know anything about wiring in a house, you know that you need complete circuits. And so, you know, you have electricity that comes into your house through a cable. And then what happens is that has to be wired from your breaker box out to all of the outlets, all of the things, and then it has to come back in, right? To complete the circuit. So in a sense, our nervous system sort of has to do that too. It has a double directional sort of response where messages can be sent to and from, with the brain sort of acting in the middle as the sort of integrator, trying to make everything excuse me, making everything work. Okay, well, let's talk about neurons, since that's what we keep mentioning these names. All right, so a neuron is another word for a nerve cell. So that's nerve cell. It's just called a neuron. So whenever we talk about a neuron, we're just talking about a cell that belongs to the nervous system. It's a cell that is specialized, and they're highly specialized in that they've given up a lot of the other processes of life in order to function the way they do. So they're highly specialized cells called neurons. And so I'm going to draw a picture of a neuron. Give yourself about a half a page for this picture. So essentially, the neuron is sort of a kind of a starry-like shaped thing, something like this. Actually, I'm going to fix that a little bit right there. Leave a space sort of on that side. And then it sort of branches. So it's kind of getting smaller and smaller like this. So there are these branches that come out of the neuron. Something like that. There you go. And then what happens is you have these elongated sections that stretch quite a distance out like this. And then it begins to branch again. Something like that on the other end. So you can kind of see it's got this very wiry nature. There'd be like a nucleus sort of somewhere in the cell. So put a nucleus in there, it suddenly looks like a cell. And there are some relatively specialized sections of this cell, so we need to learn some terminology. The little sort of branchy-like segments all around the cell, I'm just going to put a little thing like this. These are called dendrites. Dendrites. And of course, they're the spot where another neuron is going to be able to link up with this cell. They're the incoming links to the cell from another neuron. Because the nervous system, of course, is made up of chains of these neurons, all traveling, and connected to each other in a certain way, as we'll see. And this is where the incoming neuron would sort of attach to this one. Yes. No, you're going to see how it links up in a second. I'll show you that. Okay. Over here at the other end, right? We have this end. This is called the axon terminal. So this is the outgoing end. And you can see by this long extension, it's how the nerve cell reaches out to connect to another nerve cell. So the axon terminals of one would connect with the dendrites of the other. That's how it would kind of work. And then this area right here, this long arm, is actually called the axon. And then the nerve itself has a cell body, the body of the cell. Sometimes it's called just cell body, and sometimes it's called, I think they call it the soma, but we'll just call it the cell body itself. It doesn't really matter. It's pretty obvious. It doesn't require a label as such because it's not part of the key thing. So this is the main part of the cell where the nucleus is there. And this axon is like a projection that just comes out of the nerve cell. Now, sometimes you will see on this axon little sort of blobs of an insulating material. And this is called the myelin. Let's get a thinner line there. The myelin sheath. And we'll talk about that shortly in terms of what it does. That's the main idea. There's some other things we could label, like for instance, the beginning of the axon where it comes out is sometimes called the axon hillock, but we're not going to get into those details because they're not really critical to understanding how the thing works. So that's the important part of it. Now, the myelin sheath is something that may or may not be present on the nerve cell, and we're going to see what makes them different and why some have them and some don't. And we'll talk about how all of this works. So essentially, it's important for us to know that the direction of the nerve impulse is this way. This is how the nerve impulse travels. It travels from the nerve cell body down the axon to the axon terminal, which would then connect up with another neuron. So in a minute, I'll draw another picture that's smaller, showing you that connection. All right, so if you were to look at several neurons kind of strung together, what you would see is a neuron with its dendrites, and then, of course, a long extended sort of axon. And that axon then would connect to the dendrites of another neuron, something like that, right? Branches. And because the neuron has so many branches, you can have one connection. You could have several nerves connecting to a neuron. There's more than one connection, right? It's possible that another neuron, say down here, also extends out and attaches to the same neuron through its own axon. But this just creates a chain of connections that can travel the immense distances. Make the axons a little thicker. The immense distances along the body. This would end up in another terminal, which would then connect with the neuron over here, and so on. And the process would just continue, right? So you can get a network of many different neurons all interconnecting. So it doesn't have to be just a singular line. It's a network, which means you can have many connected to many. The way the nerve cells are designed, you can have several. And these complex networks of nerve cells are essentially at the heart of what makes the function of the brain possible, right? We've been studying the brain for many years, and there's still a lot we don't know about it in terms of how it generates consciousness and thoughts and things like that. But we do know that at some fundamental level, it is based on the interconnectivity of these neurons and how they communicate with each other. Okay. Now, aside from neurons, there's more to it than just neurons. Can I move now? Are you okay? I guess if I shaded in the neurons, maybe, to help you see them better. There's one. There's another one. There's another one. There's another one. We might be able to go to Google and just quickly look up a neuron, and you can see actual images of them. Let's go to images. Let's see. These are all sort of pictures, diagrammatic images. Oh, I can't, hang on, I got to turn off my pen here. Pointer, back. I'm looking for an actual picture of a neuron. I'm not sure if those are actual pictures or if those are just CGI sort of computer generated things. This looks like an actual neuron, an actual nerve cell that's been stained. And so you can see that this nerve cell has more than one axon. We've drawn our cells that have one axon, but they don't have to. They can reach out and go in many different directions. So this nerve cell has axons. You can see them traveling all over the place. My pen back here, maybe in red. You can see there's an axon traveling out here, out here, out here, out here. What's harder to see are the dendrites. It's harder to see if these are connections moving out or in. It's difficult to say, but this obviously is a stained actual microscopic view, so it's a little bit a bit different. Harder to see things. I'm sorry, say that again. Go back. Where's my back? Back. Let's see what else we have here. Here's an interesting picture that looks like it might be, or my red lines. It looks like it might be an actual picture. Eraser. Actual picture of nerve cells. So anyway, just to give you an idea of how they are all interconnected. Okay, so there's the neuron. You can Google it. You can check it out. But there are more than just neurons. There are also some kinds of cells whose job is to completely support the neurons. The neurons are so specialized that they can't live on their own. Remember, with cell specialization, just very quickly, if you have a cell, right, a simple cell, and you in grade 9 and 10, you drew it with the nucleus and mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and all of the parts of the cell, and these cells can live on their own. For instance, the paramecium is a one-celled creature that has a nucleus, and it has all these cell components, and it swims around, and it does all the jobs of life. It feeds itself, it takes in nutrients, it excretes wastes, it takes in oxygen, it does all of these things. But when cells sort of become part of multicellular organisms, what happens is they specialize. And when they specialize, that essentially means that the cells begin to take on a particular job. Very much like a human society where some people decide to take on a particular job. Somebody needs to fix cars. So if those people take on the job of mechanic, the rest of us don't have to worry about that, right? We can forget about cars and not worry about learning how to fix them. And some people have to be doctors, and some people have to be steel workers, and whatever the case may be. So in your body, it's the same idea. The cells have specialized, and they do this specialization process very early on in the embryonic development. There are genes that control, of course, how they're going to specialize. And so some cells become liver cells, and some become kidney cells, and some become skin cells, and so on. So the ones that become nerve cells become so specialized to do one job. They can't do any of the others, much like, I'm half decent at teaching school kids, but I'm not very good at repairing automobiles. I've given that up, or never had it to begin with, right? So the specialization means that neurons are highly, highly specialized. So let's just say that neurons are dependent on support cells, other cells that have to live and grow near them to maintain their function. And these cells are generally called glial cells. Glial cells. So the glia, or the glial tissue, is nerve tissue still, but they're not signal-sending cells. They are supporting cells that perform the jobs that the signal-sending neurons can't do. Now, there's many types of glial cells, and we're not going to get into all the different types. But they do various different things. So what glial cells basically do, I'll write it again, is they support neurons physically, right? They make sure that they are structural support. So let's put structural support. Neurons are fairly fragile with these long axons that are sticking out all over the place. And so structural support, these cells all around them give them sort of a stability, structural stability. They also provide nutrition or nutrients for the cells to keep them alive. Some of them produce this substance called myelin. Whoops, I spelled that. Let me spell that right. I'm kind of squeezing it in here and writing smaller. I shouldn't do that. Let's go up. They produce myelin. on some neurons. Yeah, they also can act as signaling cells. They can signal blood vessels nearby to dilate, change the blood flow in a certain region, and so on. Okay. Let's talk about this myelin for a minute. The myelin sheath is an insulating layer. Thanks. So we forgot to turn on the recorder. The myelin sheath is an insulating layer secreted by, went so fast here, special glial cells called Schwann cells. So they're a type of glial cell that secrete this myelin on some of the pathways. Typically, we find these in the peripheral nervous system, in the nerves running from the spinal cord out to the body and back, because they have to go such long distances, right? I want to go back to our picture. I should have labeled one more thing on this neuron, which I realize now I forgot. You'll notice when I drew the myelin sheath in green, there were spaces between it. And those spaces are rather important. Those spaces are called nodes of Ranvier, named after, again, people who discover things. Nodes of Ranvier. If you remember anything from physics in grade 11, if you took it, a node is sort of a spot where not much happens, kind of, right? It's the idea of no vibration. Here, a node is referring to these spaces between the myelin sheaths. So what effectively happens is these insulators allow the signal, instead of traveling all the way down the nerve cell, they allow the signal to hop from one node to the other. So I'm going to draw something down here to that effect. Schwann cells, okay? Myelin is separated by, so the myelin sheath is separated by nodes of Ranvier that allow the signal to, I'm going to just put sort of to hop from node to node rather than travel down the entire axon. So if I draw a picture of a nerve cell here and its axon, let me just draw that as a single line, it looks better. If we draw this nerve cell with its axon here, there's the axon, in an unmyelinated cell, whoops, I always forget the E, unmyelinated cell, the nerve impulse has to travel all the way down the axon through every part of it. All right? The signal travels along the entire axon. All right, so this is an unmyelinated nerve cell, and what happens is the signal travels along the entire axon. I got to, there, okay? Whereas other nerves, okay, I'll go back down, there we go. If you have a myelinated nerve cell, and you have an axon, travels this way, and I'll just draw the little bits of sort of myelin separated by the nodes of Ranvier. Then what can happen is the signal can hop. Instead of traveling down the entire axon, it can hop from node to node. So this would be a myelinated cell, or a myelinated axon. And what would happen is the signal, single. I wrote single up there too, look at that. Signal. This is Monday morning. Signal, not single. The signal travels from node to node. And what we've discovered is this makes the signal travel much faster. You can imagine if you had to pass a message to a big long chain of people by talking to the person beside you each time, and that message had to go down every person. It would be a lot easier if you could just yell your message ahead to the fourth or fifth person down the line, wouldn't it? And they could yell ahead, and then the message would happen, would get to where it's going much faster. So basically, this results in a faster nerve signal, faster signal travel. And some of our nerves must travel immense distances on the scale of cells. They travel from the tips of your toes all the way up to your lower spinal cord, and then onto your brain and back again. And so we find these myelinated cells in places where the axons and the nerve cells themselves are quite long. There's a long chain of connection, and this is to speed up the process. Question. So the question was, are they just produced like this? So the glial cells, the Schwann cells, have genetics, right, which control whether or not they're going to produce myelin or not. And so we find that the Schwann cells are located in the neurons that are, or near the neurons that are among these long distance nerves, in the sort of leaving the, there's very few in the brain because the brain doesn't have far to go. And, you know what I mean? And there's very few in the spinal cord, but we find them myelinated ones extending from that. So it's essentially a way to speed up the signal on very long nerves and nerve chains, right? That's essentially what the myelin does, hopping from node to node. Okay. All right, so now that I'm talking about central nervous system and peripheral nervous system and all of that, let's discuss what that's all about. Okay, so that's kind of enough for the actual neurons and cells themselves. We have what's called the central nervous system. The CNS. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start using these abbreviations. The central nervous system. CNS, which consists primarily of a brain and the spinal cord. Now, just a sort of interesting aside, if you look at animals and evolution of the nervous system, if you go down, you'll find in simpler animals who are sort of, who've been present a lot longer than we have on the evolutionary scale, they have relatively simple nervous systems. So for instance, if you take a starfish, has a very straightforward and simple nervous system. Essentially, they have a sort of a ring nerve in the middle, and then nerves that go out into each of the tentacles, I guess you could call it. But there's no real centralized brain that controls it. In a sense, what we have here is a very simple connection that would operate on reflex only. There's no thinking about anything. It's just kind of connecting things together, and they just do their thing, right? So there is a simple or a rudimentary messaging, but there's no integrator. There's no sort of deciding, what to do with the messages and how to regulate them. As you go on into animals that are a little bit more complex, like an earthworm, right? An earthworm has a segmented body. And what happens here is the nervous system runs down the center of the earthworm, and then there are nerves that go out of there to the various parts. But each segment has a little ball of nerve tissue called a ganglion. These are called like this a ganglion is one, or a ganglia if you're plural. There are several ganglia. And each segment is kind of independent of the others in terms of its function. And these little nerve bundles serve as primitive integrators. They're like primitive brains in a sense. The nerves would come back in and out. They would, but there's no traveling from this region of the worm. Sensory perception doesn't really travel all the way up to a brain in the top. It essentially travels back and forth in each segment, right? Insects are the same, but then what we start noticing is we start getting more and more complex. So in insects, I'll just draw a general insect body plan here. We have the actual brain. We have a large ganglion. There are still ganglia, but the one in the head seems to be sort of taking a more important role. If you think about the whole concept of a head, right? Worms really don't actually have a head as such. They have an anterior end and a posterior end. Typically, we think about the head as the place where food goes in, but it's much more than that. If you look at a human head or an insect head, you can see that there's a very highly centralized sensory nature, right? We have eyes, ears, nose, and mouth all in our head. So there's a lot of sensory information that's coming into a head. It's sort of like it's been designed, or it's been selected by evolution to be a very major sensory apparatus. And so that means the ganglion inside is very busy. It's doing a lot of things, and it becomes much larger over time and more centralized. And so eventually you get to, a human. And in a human, we have a definite head. We have arms and legs, right? And then it's an insect, the other one. Insect. And of course, we have a relatively large brain. And then that brain extends down into our spinal cord. And then from there, we have nerves that branch out and down to the rest of the body and back again. We also have ganglia along our spine. And they still function very much in the same way that these ones in the insect and the worm would. So I'm going to show you some interesting things that happened in the human skeleton. So the brain and spinal cord is the central nervous system. I'm going to draw a big picture now. So here's the human brain. We know that it comes in sort of two lobes. Has some structures there. And we'll put some squigglies all around it. There we go. There's the human brain. And then there's this long spinal cord that extends downward through our back. Some animals have a ventral nerve cord. We have a dorsal one along the back. And it's encased with protective bone, the vertebra, right? Vertebrates. They belong to the class of animals called vertebrates. I think it's a super class, actually. But anyway, vertebrates are animals that have a backbone. Some animals just have a nerve cord that runs down their back without any bone around it. They're more primitive, obviously. But then, so there's the central nervous system in black, the CNS. I'm going to color code it. Then we have something called the peripheral nervous system. So the PNS, which stands for peripheral nervous system. I'm not going to write that. You can write it down yourself. Peripheral nervous system. And it consists of all of the afferent and efferent neurons that branch off of the spinal cord, right? What I'm going to do, though, is go back and I'm going to put these little ganglia on the spinal cord. Just some indicators. Okay? And so typically the nerves come off. There are nerves that go back up and into the neck and feed the face. There are nerves that branch off towards where the arms go. There are nerves then that innervate the chest area and the abdomen area. Then there are nerves that go down into the legs. and innervate the leg area. The peripheral nervous system are these nerves that branch off of the spinal cord and lead to, now in this picture, it's hard to draw this. They lead to, but they also lead back. There would also be other nerves that come back to this, right? It's hard to draw that on this picture. And that's, of course, the afferent and efferent nerves. The afferent nerve, sorry, what was that? Typically, they branch off from the ganglion, but they don't have to. I don't suppose they could branch off anywhere from the nerve cord, but typically there's a ganglion associated with the branching. So there's two pathways, sort of general pathways, where something can happen. So now I'm gonna let you catch up to this picture because you're probably a little behind. All right, so pathways. Let's see here. So I'm going to draw this brain again. And our central nervous system. Okay. And then I'm going to draw, put a little ganglion here. And I'm going to draw a little neuron going out. And then in green, I'm going to draw a neuron coming back in. Okay. So we'll put a little arrow here going this way, and on the red one, going that way. So what we have is sensory input coming in. So that would be an afferent neuron. Afferent neuron. And then the red one would be motor action coming back out. So this would be a, we typically call them a motor neuron, not necessarily a motor neuron. Let's call this the efferent neuron. A motor neuron is a type of efferent neuron that specifically stimulates a muscle to do something. Many of the efferent neurons are motor neurons, but some also connect to glands and other things that cause things to happen. So the signal path, I'm going to draw it, well, I'll keep these colors. So typically you get a sensation. Let's say this is a fingertip and there's a touch sensor, which is a special kind of nerve ending. Eventually the chain of nerves ends, and the last neuron on the chain is a specialized nerve ending that is sensitive to pressure. Pressure causes its membrane to change. We'll learn exactly what that means later. That change initiates a signal, which travels along the green sensory neuron. Now, if it's along the green neuron, it's going to hit this ganglion, and then it's going to go up to the brain. And it'll be routed through the brain. There are many different sections of the brain and parts of the brain that work sort of interconnectedly, but we've noticed that some sections tend to be a little more important for certain things than others. It's almost like the brain is developing a bit of specialization where parts of the brain handle certain signals. But we also know that the brain is very plastic. So if you remove those parts, other parts will pick up the slack and do that too. It's weird. Once it gets to the brain, it gets integrated, which means you've decided, oh, something's touching my finger. And then you send the signal back down the efferent neuron. The efferent neuron might connect to muscles. Maybe it is a motor neuron that connects to muscles, right? And so what that would do is it would cause you to then decide to do something with your finger. So depending on the stimulus, if you were petting a furry kitten, a nice sensation of kitten would travel here to the ganglion, travel up to the brain, and the brain would say, oh, we like the furry kitten, and it would send back a signal to make your fingers gently stroke the cat and enjoy the furry kitten, right? Little nice cats. Unless it's a rabid cat, then it would turn and attack you and bite you, give you rabies, and then you have to endure a series of shots and vaccines. So that's why you just stay away from animals altogether, even the cute ones. Because, you know, they could be rabid, so you don't want that. Or here's what else can happen. Here's another interesting thing, that ganglion there has a purpose. Here's the second option. So that would be sort of sort of in integrating the brain as part of the entire flow of information, right? Watch this. Here's the brain again. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Remember that commercial? Frying eggs? Yeah. Okay. And here's our ganglion. Let's say this time, though, the sensory neuron, the green one, is a different receptor. This sensory neuron is picking up heat because your finger is on next to a burning match, and it's extremely hot. So the sensory neuron sends the signal of my finger is burning to the central nervous system, to the spinal cord. But what's cool is that the spinal cord, this ganglion, can immediately reroute that back as an efferent neuron, which basically would sort of be the one that pulled your finger away from the hot, the efferent pathway. And then what it would do is, because essentially there's no time. There's no time to send the signal up to the brain, have it processed. And can you imagine? You stick your finger in a match, and then you get a sensation that goes to the brain. The match is burning. My finger. Oh, gee, what should we do? Let's have a meeting. Figure it out. And then by the time you make a decision, it's too late. You know, the brain does not work like modern corporations and businesses do, where there's a decision to be made, a problem to be solved. It has to go to head office. 2 weeks later, they come up with a decision, and by then, it doesn't matter anymore because whatever happened has already happened, right? That would not be very evolutionarily successful. So what happens is, while this immediate turnaround is happening, the signal would also go up to the brain, but it's independent of the efferent pathway. And once it gets to the brain, it's basically just letting the brain know, by the way, we moved your finger. So you are aware of it, but you don't have to think about it. You don't have to make the decision. And this is, of course, what we call a reflex action, right? A reflex action is one where the sensory input is very instantly shuttled right back to the efferent pathway, bypassing the brain to make some kind of action happen quickly, but also letting the brain know that it's happened. So it does trickle up to the top, but it's more of a, we don't really need you to make a decision. We're just letting you know that we've moved the finger. So many of you have been to the doctor. Reflex actions, the most common reflex action that they can test is when they hit just below your kneecap, your patella, with a little rubber hammer, and there's a nerve there. And if they stimulate that nerve will shoot up to your lower back, where the nerve catches the lower ganglion, and then it will immediately shoot an efferent signal right back to kick out the knee or the leg. And the reason for that reflex is, if you're running from a lion or a bear, right, and it's going to eat you, and you stub your toe, when you stub your toe, your instinct is to buckle your leg under you, right? You pull back and you pull up your leg. And if you were running and you did that, you would stumble and possibly fall. So the reflex is, if you stub your toe, the signal goes to your spine and right back, and the reflex is to kick out your leg so that instead of buckling it under you, you kick it out so that it'll catch you on the next step and you keep running. So the reflex in your leg is designed to save us when we have an issue with our leg and we're trying to escape from saber-toothed tigers, right? Most of us never have that happen, so the reflex is more or less just a weird thing the doctor does to make our legs kick. But that's its purpose. And there's no time when you're running to send a message to the brain and sort of ask it if it feels like we should kick the leg out or not. So that's the reflex action. And that's what these little ganglia are functioning as. But the superganglion, the brain itself, in humans is highly specialized to become what we call the brain, right? The integrator. Whereas in the smaller or more primitive animals, the brain has less of a difference between the other ganglia. Okay, there we go. What's next? Yeah, question. So one other interesting thing, if we draw the brain again, and we go down the spine, what we find is there's regions of the spine, and we may as well just kind of highlight those now. The top region of the spine is called the cervical region because it's in the neck area, the cervical region. And this involves the vertebrae are in the bones in our back are actually numbered, right? So C1 to C8, those are just the numbers of the cervical vertebrae. The bones, if you run your finger down your back, you bump, 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 right? You can feel each individual vertebra. And so the purpose of the cervical vertebrae is to serve the head and neck area and the arms. So all of the nerves that go to the head, neck, arms, and maybe some back muscles too. The head, neck, arms, and some of the back. Right? Would have cervical nerves. So all the nerves that go out of here are going to those places. And so, of course, if you sever the spine at this point, then everything below here may not work. Okay, so when you think about injuries to the spine, you have to think about where it happens. The next section is a little bit longer, and it's called the thoracic section, the thoracic vertebrae. Whoops, sorry, thoracic, sorry, not... Thoracic. It serves the chest and the abdomen. So this would control your breathing, control your heart, would control all the organs, right? The organs in your abdomen, digestion, and so on. Then we have, I'm going to run out of room here, another layer. I'm going to have to extend my, my spine a bit. We have another layer called the lumbar region. Nope, there's actually two more after this, but they're small. The lumbar region of the spine. Oh, and I didn't write the vertebra. It was T1 to 12 on the other one. So let me go back there. T1 to T12. T stands for thoracic. So thoracic ones labeled, there's 12 of them. There's a few more. And then we have the lumbar region, which are the L1 to 5, so not as many. They serve primarily the legs. Legs. Yeah, body part. Think body parts. The next one is the what we call the sacral nerves. Spine. Sacral nerves. This would be S1 to S5. And these are right at the bottom. They're basically the bowel, the bladder, and sex organs. And then lastly, there's a tiny little section. I'll do it in another color here. I'll do it on the other side just so I have space. This one is called the coccygeal. Two C's, so you pronounce one as a K and one as a C. Coccygeal. CO1. It's a CO because cervical was a C, right? So they use a CO. And this is for basically the rectum and anus. That's really all it is. So depending on where you have injury to the spinal cord, essentially if you injure it, and by injury I mean usually a severing of the cord, which would happen if you had a severe back injury, right? or neck injury. Depending on where you separate that cord, essentially everything below it would stop working. So typically what happens with many people is they get lumbar problems. Lumbar is the lower part of your spine. Whenever you bend over, you're always stretching the lumbar region of your back. And what can happen there is you get soreness and stiffness in the back. And then there's, of course, a major nerve called the sciatic nerve that runs from there down into the legs, runs down the inside of your leg. And you can get tremendous shooting pain down the sciatic nerve if you have issues with your lumbar region of your back, because it obviously innervates the legs. Yeah. Oh, this is later. It's on 537. I just decided to throw it up here now because we're talking about it, and it kind of made sense to fit it in. If you think about it, sex organs are extremely important, aren't they? All biological creatures have evolved to essentially have sex. Well, no, that's not true. All sexually reproducing biological creatures have evolved to have sex. The sex organs are innervated by the very bottom of the spine. Right? So any kind of damage to the spine has the potential of interfering with the function of sex organs. Yeah. Yep. That's it. The coccygeal. Coccygeal. The coccyx. The coccyx is a word that we use to describe your little tailbone, which is the very bottom of your spine. Right? That little thing that you often, when you sit down too hard on pavement or something and it hurts, that's called your tailbone. All right. Many people get neck injuries. That's a commonplace danger because it's a very vulnerable part of your body, right? Your neck and head. And injuries there are usually pretty traumatic because they can result in very poor functioning of just about everything. So, a quadriplegic loses the use of arms and legs, has difficulty breathing, has difficulty, all kinds of problems. So you don't want to have a neck injury, but unfortunately that's one of the more common places to get injured. If you're diving, jumping, doing any kind of sport, gymnastics, twisting, whatever, and you twist your head and get it bent the wrong way, you have potential for neck injury. Question? It's possible. Now, there's also quite a bit of redundancy built into humans, right? So severing your spine depends on what kind of damage it is. I mean, if you took it and completely severed it with scissors and cut it right off, well, obviously that would likely be, if it was high enough in the cervical or thoracic area, that would likely be lethal. No, the spinal cord and the other cells of the brain, which are the central nervous system, do not replace themselves and do not regrow once they're damaged. The peripheral nerves can. If you've ever had a surgery and they cut through your skin, you'll find after surgery you have numbness, and that's because they've cut through some of those peripheral nerves. But over time, and sometimes it takes years, those nerves will grow back and you will get sensation back in the area. But the central nervous system does not regrow itself. And that's why we've been doing so much research lately by using stem cells, which are undifferentiated, and injecting them into the nervous system where they make the decision to become nerve cells and take the place of the damaged nerves. And there's quite a bit of success with that. It's quite likely that in a generation or two, we will be able to repair spinal cord injuries far, far more effectively than we can now. Anyway, just to give you an idea of all of that. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about, actually, I think we'll finish this video here and we'll do a separate video. We're going to talk about the actual nerve signal itself and how that actually works. And it's a bit of membrane chemistry. So it's going to be a little bit involved, but it's stuff that you're pretty much familiar with already because we've been through the membrane stuff with the transport, electron transport and all the photosynthesis stuff. So it's sort of, in a way, similar to that.